Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Michael Hanegan. I am a theologian and a senior fellow at the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute. My work primarily revolves around the intersection of trauma and other forms of suffering and the development of Christian theology, language, and practice, both within individuals and across theological traditions. And what I want to do today, in our brief time together, is to try and explore part of the reason behind the church's historical struggle of addressing the complexity and vulnerability of mental health, and thinking about the ways in which the Christian tradition itself has been largely shaped by formative and malformative experiences of trauma and suffering. I hope to demonstrate to you that part of the challenge that the church has faced in these ways is due to the way in which we think about our values and our beliefs theologically, particularly the way that we think about sin and suffering. And so, what I hope to do in our time together today is to lay out some failures, some possibilities, and some practices. I want us to be able to think deeply about where we've come from and where we find ourselves, to think about the things that are possible if we are willing to consider the current state of our shared life and the way that we wish it to be, and to nurture those possibilities. And then finally, to end with three concrete practices that will help us think about what we might do now and going forward for us to do these things together. So, what I want to suggest as we begin is to think about the ways in which the church has regularly failed to respond to the realities of trauma and suffering, and particularly in the way in which it impacts the way that the church has responded to the realities of mental health, particularly challenges of mental health. That all of those failures, the ethical failures, the pastoral failures, the concrete ways that we have let one another down, that we have failed to respond to harm, and in many cases have inflicted additional unnecessary harm. What I want us to consider today is that those are rooted in many ways in developments in which trauma has shaped the way that we think about Christian faith and practice. So, what I want to do is start here with three failures that I think are connected, but that help us to make sense of the ways in which this has developed over time in Christian tradition. The first failure we need to talk about is the way that we think about sin. Uh, and what I want to suggest here is not that we discard the way that we have thought about sin, but that we reappropriate it in a way that allows us to have a more robust and more meaningful understanding of sin. I don't know about you, but having been in Christian community my entire life, I don't think I can recall a time in which sin was meaningfully discussed in a way that was outside of the following construction. Sin is something that I have done that I should not have done, or the failure to do something that I should have done. In other words, it is sin that I commit by a failure to act or by acting in a way that was wrong. And this is real and this is true. This is consistent both with Christian faith and human experience. That sin is the number of ways in which we fail other people and we fail ourselves in the ways that we choose to act, whether by omission or commission. The primary challenge that's presented to us, though, in that particularly narrow view of sin is this. There seems to me, for the most part, for most people who are serious about the kind of life that they live, who intentionally try to avoid these traditionally understood definitions of sin, who try to live life in a way that is just and good and righteous, that the majority of our human experience is not actually an experience of sin in that way. So is it true that we should avoid things and that we should be committed to acting in ways that sometimes we refuse to do? Yes, of course. But this particularly narrow view of sin leaves us in a really bad place in the midst and aftermath of trauma and suffering when we don't have good language to talk about sin outside of what I have done or what I have failed to do. We'll come back to this in the possibilities here in a minute to talk about what an expanded view of sin might look like. But suffice it for now to say that overly simplistic understanding of sin, the narrow definition of sin as something that I do or have failed to do, that I have done or failed to do, does not allow us to meaningfully consider the ways in which our actual lived experience emerges. And this, I think, has profound consequences for mental health and for care. The second failure is that the Christian tradition has largely not been reflective about the way in which identifiable experiences of trauma and suffering have shaped the way that Christians think about life and faith and practice. If you were to, as a historian or as a theologian, to pay attention to the times in which the Christian tradition has undergone some significant theological development, some change, some drastic change in theology, language, or practice, it is my contention that almost always you would be able to find some substantive or ongoing experience of trauma and suffering that shape the result of that development. Let me just give you a couple of examples. For Augustine in the 4th century, one of the real life challenges that Augustine struggles with at the intersection of faith and his actual experience is what to do with the suffering of children, particularly small children, infants, toddlers, young children who really, in the sense that they would think of in his time, had no agency. And yet they would suffer profoundly and die. And Augustine didn't know how to make sense of this, because that narrow view of sin as sin that I commit and sin that I fail to do the right thing, when it's about guilt, that is a conduit by which suffering and trauma occur. He didn't have good language to make sense of the suffering of these little ones. And so he attempts to find some help. He writes to Jerome, one of the great lights of his day, and for whatever reason doesn't receive a reply. And long story short, the end result is the development of the doctrine of original sin, in which basically it says, look, even if you didn't do something or fail to do something, which is that correct, albeit incomplete view of sin, that you are in some way guilty of the original sin, that the sin of Adam and Eve is somehow held against you, and that this explains why in the world little ones suffer. Or if we fast forward, more than a millennia to John Calvin. John Calvin and his doctrines of predestination are particularly rooted in his extensive experiences of trauma and suffering. My favorite biography of Calvin begins by basically saying, had Calvin not been so riddled with anxiety, he never would have accomplished as much, and we wouldn't have experienced the Reformation in the way that we did. In other words, all the life experience that Calvin brought to that time in his life was rooted in this profoundly impactful and malformative experience of serious suffering. He loses his mother at a young age. He's sent off to a boarding school, which has its own experiences of trauma tied into it. He is a survivor of a tour as combat veteran, and then all the violence of the earliest days of the Reformation. It is not surprising that when Calvin gets to the end of his life, and he has somehow survived all of this, it makes perfect sense that one of the conclusions which Calvin would come to in order to hold both his faith and his experience together was that one of the reasons that he survived and so many did not is that God decided before the beginning of the world that this is exactly how it would be. When we are aware of these kinds of backstories to the complexities of the theological tradition, we're able to do two things that are important, and we'll talk about these in a little while. One is that we're able to understand that these are real human beings, not just abstract ideas, and we're able to be more generous and mindful of the ways in which this language, theology, and practice impacts real life, both for the people who developed it and for the people who subsequently inherit and inhabit it. The second is this: we are able to find the ways in which it makes sense of that moment, but not necessarily of the human experience. And we'll talk about that more in the possibilities. The third failure we've got to talk about is just the fact that oftentimes the church has just failed in its capacity to care, to provide the kind of nurture and healing and safety that is necessary when things get really difficult. And this comes from two things. One, sometimes a failure of care occurs because the community doesn't care. It is just an abject failure of ethics and integrity. But the other reason that the church has often failed in the midst and aftermath of trauma and suffering is just that it is woefully inadequate to respond to both the quantity and severity of that trauma and suffering. And so while we're mindful of that, we'll talk here in just a moment about the ways in which we can build and enhance that capacity. So sometimes we've done poorly because we chose to do poorly. And sometimes we've done poorly because we didn't know what to do. Now, there are three possibilities here that I want us to explore in our time together as we think about what could come, as we think about the intersection of Christian faith, trauma, suffering, and in this case, mental health. The first possibility is for us to develop a more robust view of sin. Not just the sin that I commit by either doing the wrong thing or failing to do the right thing, but to expand our language to think about not only sin that I commit, but sin that is done to me, or sin that impacts my life, but that hasn't been done directly to me, sin that has been perpetrated against my parents or my affinity group or my society or some other primary object of that harm, but that also shapes the way in which I experience the world. And then finally, there are experiences of trauma and suffering that deeply shape my life, that you can't necessarily put your finger on them as being tied to sin. However, this is where Scripture's expressions about the powers of sin and death come in handy. They help us to recognize that things that misshape human beings in ways that push against their capacity to live and to flourish and to nurture one another, to take care of neighbor, and to build a better, more peaceful, more beautiful, more just and kind world, those are counter to what we believe in Christian faith is the work of God in the world. So this one possibility is that we begin to build language that allows us to think more deeply about the things that malform us that aren't necessarily just about the mistakes that we've made. And the reason that we have to be able to do this is that when we have a narrow view of sin only as my perpetration of bad things and my failure to do good, then when we find ourselves encountered with trauma and suffering, especially trauma and suffering that has profound consequences for our mental health, we are trapped in categories of saying, I must deserve this. I must have done something or failed to do something that caused this to be the case. Any clinician or frankly, anyone who's close to someone who's been through some really difficult things, it is not uncommon for us to find people who presume their own guilt and their own complicity in their suffering, in their victimization. This is not because it's true, but it is because we have reached the limits of our language. And so a better, richer, more robust, more descriptive language of the way in which we are harmed by others and by things outside of ourselves is an essential tool to the possibility in which religious communities and religious people have the capacity to more meaningfully respond in the midst and aftermath of trauma and suffering, particularly as it reflects on mental health. The second possibility is that we work hard to expand our capacity for care, that we think about the ways in which we are nurtured and equipped and trained and educated to think about how we love and care for and serve one another. One of the challenges that I think happens here when we think about our capacity to care is that our knee-jerk reaction is that the larger the wound, the greater the chance that we presume that our act of care has to be proportionate to the harm that has occurred. When we're driving home from work and we see that someone has rear-ended someone else, but it appears that everyone is physically fine, even if they are upset, we often drive by and wish them well. But when we see a car absolutely crumbled, some of us have the desire to pull off the road and see if we can help. Others feel a much more intense feeling of empathy and solidarity with the people who are tied into those things. So often, we are paralyzed in our capacity to care for one another, particularly when things have gone really badly, because we feel as if our act of nurture and care must be as large as the wound that has been committed. And this is just not true. In fact, it is my contention that it is the ongoing, sustainable, more subtle forms of care that in the long run actually continue to pay dividends. One of my favorite examples of this is the large body of evidence that suggests that within 24 hours of a traumatic experience, if someone will take the time to play Tetris, the game, that we can have a significant reduction in the recurrence of intrusive flashbacks and all the other consequences that that bears in the aftermath of trauma for that person. And so one of the things that I often suggest to people is that if you find yourself in a really awful situation, when you find out that someone has been in an accident and is at the ER, if you are not a medical doctor, there is often very little that you can do. But helping those kids in the lobby who are waiting to find out what's happening, to play Candy Crush, to play Tetris, can be a form of care that has an immeasurable impact on the subsequent years of their lives. That when things are off the rails, when they're out of control, when they're unpredictable and unmanageable, there are still forms of care that need to be addressed. That so often we don't always remember necessarily what someone said, but that they were there. We still have to eat. We still need to sleep. We need people to listen to us, to be present, to be available. But that when we think about care, one of the things that we need to begin to recognize, and that Christian faith teaches us, is that we are always giving to others rooted in the things that we ourselves have received. So this is where we take scriptural texts seriously, such as comfort one another with the comfort you have received, right? That the key here is that our capacity to offer comfort to another person is grounded in the comfort that we ourselves have already been the recipient of from other people. And so one of the ways in which we enhance our capacity to care is to inhabit spaces in which we are receiving care. And that dynamic of reception and diffusion, of giving and receiving, of taking opportunities to be cared for in order that we can take advantage of opportunities to offer care. These are the ways in which we enhance our capacity for care and for nurture. These are the ways in which we make ourselves more available to people who, for whatever reason, life has not gone as we would have hoped. The third possibility is this, that as we continue to think more deeply about the way in which we talk about and respond to trauma and suffering, particularly the way that our language of sin is animated, and as we enhance our capacity for care, we actually have what I think is a really beautiful opportunity to re-envision our shared life, not just as reactive, but as preventative. Pope Francis often talks about the church as a field hospital, that we are the people who run into the middle of the battlefield to collect and gather the wounded in order to take them to a place where they may receive kind of the triage care that they need. And that's essential. There are far too many people stranded in the midst of the battlefield who need nurture and care. But I also wonder what it would look like for us to cultivate communities where our capacity for care and our capacity to think meaningfully about the breadth of human experience, about not just the things that we shouldn't do that we do and the things that we fail to do that we should, but to think about the ways in which we harm one another, or the ways in which the places in which we live, the communities and systems and structures and organizations that we inhabit can inflict things upon us, the ways in which we are just vulnerable creatures whose lives can be upended or even ended in a moment. That we think meaningfully about caring for one another when things are fine. And what I want to do with the rest of our time today is to think about three practices. So the first, in many Christian traditions, we regularly have a confession of sin. And so this is a way in which we say, often through some liturgy or pre-written prayer, these are the things that I have done that I should not have done, or the things that I should have done that I failed to do. And we repent and seek forgiveness and absolution for those things. I want to suggest that one way in which we might begin to practice our way to a world in which the church thinks more meaningfully about trauma and suffering, and by extension then mental health, is to have the capacity to say, this is what has happened to me. To confess our wounds. To say, I am here to share and to name and to lament the things that have occurred in my life. And that this does two things. One, it gives people the space to articulate and to process the realities of life in the context of faith. And second, it provides the community an opportunity to become aware and to become responsive to those realities. Attached here, I have provided a resource in which this practice might actually be done in Christian community for you to consider. The second is a part of the medieval mystical tradition, what is called the little way. If you want to learn more about this, you can learn about Therese of Lisieux. And here's what she suggests. That the call to love is not the call to something outsized, to something incredibly large and where everyone can see. But that the primary way in which Christian faith is effectively and faithfully lived in the world is through the little way, through things that people do not see and do not know, but that bring light and love and nurture and care into the world. And I think this is true. The way in which we do better is not to create programs and curriculums and structures and organizations and conferences, but to think meaningfully about how we care for one another in 1,000 little ways. That we look for the people, not who are famous, but who are forgotten. That we look for those who we cannot solve all of their problems, but we can gift them some form of nurture and care. We do. And the third piece, which I think is particularly important, and this is where I want to end today, because I think it is the place where, particularly in the last few decades, the church has particularly been resistant to this important practice. And that is that the church should be committed to care through connections to people outside of the church. When I teach in seminaries, I often bring with me a copy of that year's Annie E. Casey Foundation report, which goes state by state and talks about child welfare. And I often go in with the same, with the report, and then with the demographic information of the number of congregations, the total attendance, and the estimated collective budgetary value of all those churches. So how many people, how many churches, how much money in that same state. And I encourage students to look at that report, to choose one issue of child welfare, just one, in their state, and to see if, with that many people and that much money, they have the wisdom, expertise, money, and infrastructure to eliminate any single issue by themselves as the church. If the church were to say, we are not going to do anything but solve this problem, none of our money, none of our people do anything else, could we eradicate this particular form of maltreatment or suffering related to the lives of children in our state? And the answer is always no. This is for a couple of reasons. One, we do not have the money and the expertise and the infrastructure to deal with any one of those particular issues. There are always times when we are out of our depth. There are always times when we are out of our expertise. There are always times when it is inappropriate for people in certain roles to try and offer solutions that should be offered by people who are more thoroughly and properly qualified to do so. In the same way that we do not go to our clergy for a refill on our prescription meds. In the same way that we do not ask the person over church maintenance to set a broken bone. One of the primary ways in which the church can show care is through connections with people in the community and in other places that have the proper training, credentials, expertise, and resources to address trauma, suffering, and mental health that the church simply does not have, and frankly has no business trying to replace. And that sometimes a referral, a connection, a handoff can actually be a profound form of care because it involves two moves. If it's an act of care, it involves two things. One, it involves a recognition that what you need is beyond my capacity, but that it is within my capacity to connect you to someone who can meet that need. So it's not a dismissal, it's not an exile, it is an intentional delivery towards someone who can do what they need to be done. And the second is this. It is true of every institution that when things go bad, the first response is to preserve the institution. And care through connections of people who are outside, who are capable, who have the wisdom, experience, expertise, and infrastructure to do those things is one way in which we hold ourselves accountable. It's one way in which we offer care, even when it's uncomfortable, even when we failed to do so, even when we've messed up, and we should rightfully be named for what we've done. That we have this capacity to do the right thing by being willing to share the load, the burden, the opportunity to provide nurture and care for someone with other people who are qualified to do so. So here's what I hope that we can see as we begin to wind down today. One, we need to think meaningfully about the ways in which our practices around trauma and suffering and mental health in the church are deeply shaped by realities that we often don't consider. That sometimes it is the limits of our faith that make these things worse than they need to be. Second is that we can do better. There has never been a better time in Christian history to think meaningfully about the intersections of trauma, suffering, and mental health and Christian faith than there is now. There are more people, there is more writing, there are more scholars, more practitioners, more innovators, more people who can help us to do things the way that we should have been doing them for a long time than there are right now. And finally, this is the time for all of us, whether we are clergy or clinicians or chaplains, social workers, church leaders, parents, whatever our relationship to the person who is suffering, that we have the capacity to offer meaningful expressions of care, both in the way that we act and in the way that we connect people to the resources that they need. Below, you're going to find some resources that I suggest and I regularly use with people who are working in these intersections. Thank you for your interest in this conversation, for your desire to do what is right and best for people, and for your commitment to doing those things through the lens of Christian faith. I hope the rest of the summit is wonderful for you and that you continue to learn and develop your skills in ways that help you and that serve and guide and love and nurture the world in which we live. Thank you so much.